Hello and welcome to Spill the Tea. True Stories, the place where real life is more fascinating than fiction. Sit back, pour yourself a cup of tea, and let's dive into the moments that stay with us forever. We're starting now. Sarah trudged from the bus stop towards home. It was the very beginning of spring, and it was getting dark noticeably later. Just 2 weeks ago, at this time, it would have been pitch black night, but now it was just light lilac twilight. The woman's hands were pulled down by 2 bags of groceries: fruit for her daughter, bread, a good piece of meat from which she could make both borscht and goulash. And treats, of course. How could she do without them? She had received her advance pay today. Tomorrow was a day off, which meant Sarah and her daughter would have their traditional Friday movie night. Katie had already chosen some comedy. Sarah smiled. Her daughter, if anything made the woman's life happy, full, and meaningful, it was her, Katie. And now she was already 8 years old. The girl attended the school near their house. She was an excellent student. Although Sarah never helped her with homework, just occasionally with extra projects, nothing more. The woman wished she could spend more time with her child, but she had to work a lot, a great deal, to provide for herself and her daughter. Well, Katie managed perfectly well on her own. She was responsible, quick-witted, serious, and very independent. Since first grade, the girl had to do everything herself. She went to school alone because by the time Katie left the house, her mother was already halfway to work on the bus. She returned alone to an empty apartment after school, tidied up, ate lunch, sat down to do homework, set an alarm on her phone to start getting ready for practice on time. Katie played basketball in the school section. The coach said the little girl had an iron character and great prospects in the sport. A miracle, not a child. Sarah smiled, thinking of her girl. Yes, she was incredibly lucky with her. And yet, the woman looked with heartache at the children everywhere accompanied by caring adults, loving grandparents, stay-at-home mothers, fathers. These girls and boys had more time for games. They were cared for, they were looked after. Adults made the little ones' lives happier, brighter, safer. Yes, at first Sarah was very worried that her little girl, with a huge backpack on her shoulders, was walking everywhere alone. Her colleagues were all surprised. "Aren't you afraid some bad person will take her? What if a dog attacks her? What if she gets lost?" Sarah just sighed. Of course, all these fears were present. There was no escaping them. But Sarah was sure that Katie would not go anywhere with a stranger, would bypass a pack of dogs, and would certainly find her way home. She was surprisingly mature for her age, attentive, sensitive, intelligent. Besides, Sarah had no other choice. She couldn't afford to stay home with the child. And she couldn't even change jobs to something closer to home because the brick factory where the woman worked as an economist paid well. It had cost her so much to get this job. Her salary now exceeded the average in the big city. A single mother with a daughter didn't live lavishly, but the money was enough for clothes, apartment rent, groceries, and even entertainment. If Sarah earned less, they simply wouldn't survive. And then Mrs. Smith would be able to do what she had been dreaming of for so long. Remembering her former mother-in-law, Sarah shivered and pulled her shoulders in. A terrible person. Yet once she had seemed so sweet, so open, so kind to Sarah. When Mark brought a pregnant Katie to meet his parents many years ago, the girl was very nervous. She understood perfectly well how their situation looked from the outside. A girl from a village, without a stick or a stone, without a penny to her name, had charmed a guy from a wealthy family, muddled the young man's mind, taken advantage of his weaknesses, deliberately gotten pregnant. And now Mark was simply obligated to marry her as an honest and noble man. In reality, of course, it wasn't like that at all. But even Sarah's classmates, who knew her very well, made such assumptions. "Well done!" The red-haired Jessica sincerely praised her, hearing the news. "You seem so quiet and proper, but you managed to arrange your life in a way we couldn't even dream of. Now you'll live and want for nothing. Excellent plan. By the way, I should try that too. Why not? I also want to be the wife of a rich husband. It's a normal desire. The girls weren't being sarcastic or malicious. They were genuinely happy for their friend, who, as they saw it, had pulled off a risky scheme and emerged victorious, getting a proposal from an eligible bachelor. Perhaps it was after her friend's reaction that Sarah realized everyone else thought the exact same way. And Mark's parents? They would, of course, look at her as an enemy. Well, naturally. A village bumpkin had appeared in the big city and decided to settle here through a successful marriage. Mark was indeed from a very wealthy family, but Sarah didn't find this out right away. The guy wore simple jeans, t-shirts, and preferred comfortable sneakers to expensive shoes. Yes, it turned out the watch on his wrist and his mobile phone were expensive. An experienced eye would have immediately appreciated this. But how could a village girl know the cost of accessories? A watch was a watch. A phone was a phone. Mark usually came to university on a motorcycle. Many guys arrived in expensive cars. There, it was immediately clear that their families had wealth. But here, a motorcycle. Sarah had always thought bikes weren't that expensive. Anyone could afford one. And Mark also worked part-time at a large real estate company, doing some not particularly skilled job, a courier or something like that. So Sarah wasn't surprised by his motorcycle. He had probably saved up from his salary or taken out a loan. At the beginning of his relationship with Sarah, Mark didn't mention that the company he worked for belonged to his father. The girl couldn't have guessed that his parents were so successful and wealthy. Sarah had watched Mark from afar for a long time. They were on different faculties. The guy was a student of the prestigious finance and economics program. After school, Sarah had also desperately wanted to get in there. She studied hard, sitting over textbooks day and night, but she didn't make it into that faculty. She didn't pass. Sarah, a poor village girl, wanted to escape poverty. She had wonderful parents, kind, understanding, supportive. But Sarah didn't want to repeat their fate. They lived in a small house without plumbing. A huge wash basin hung on the wall, and that's where they had to wash. The toilet was outside, and there was a bathhouse in the yard, but they only heated it on weekends. Sarah's parents worked hard, but there wasn't enough money in the family. Was it like everyone else? Other families lived exactly the same way. It was just that in their village, there was objectively a lack of jobs for everyone, and salaries were tiny. People didn't despair, they struggled, they survived. But for herself, Sarah didn't want such a fate. Her parents supported their daughter in her desire to get an education and stay living in the big city. They even tried not to burden Sarah with household chores, wanting the girl to devote all her time to studying. "Study, daughter," her mother instructed. "Study, don't be lazy. God willing, you'll make something of yourself. You have a head on your shoulders. The teacher says you're smart and promising," her father echoed. Sarah really was the best in her class. Studying came easily to her. The entrance exams to the university were perceived by Sarah as an important matter that would be a turning point in the fight for a happy life. And the girl endured this battle with dignity. Based on the exam results, Sarah scored many points, a result that pleasantly surprised the applicant. But still, these points were not enough to get into the state-funded department of the Finance and Economics faculty. Sarah then felt disappointment mixed with surprise. How could this be? In her school, she was head and shoulders above the others, and why had so many people suddenly surpassed her? Only later did the girl learn about tutors who coached applicants for test questions, and about the little gifts that prospective students' parents brought to the dean's office. But back then, Sarah blamed herself for not preparing well enough. She was just a few points short of getting into the state-funded program. At the same time, she easily qualified for the fee-paying department. "Well, you'll study for a year or two on a paid basis, and then someone will surely be expelled, and you'll transfer to the state-funded program." An unfamiliar senior student girl comforted Sarah. She couldn't pass by Sarah, who was crying by the results board. "Many people do that. You were just a little short of points. which means you've got brains. They like and promote such students." Sarah just shook her head. This girl couldn't understand that for her family, even a year's tuition fee was an unbearable burden. Sarah had already decided that the year was lost. She would have to return to the village and prepare for admission again, this time more seriously. And even that wasn't a guarantee that the girl's dream would come true the following year. But that same comforter, the random senior student Sarah met along the way, offered a completely different solution. "Why do you need this finance and economics?" She shrugged. "Mostly only connections study there, and children of rich parents. The education is practically the same at the enterprise economics faculty. It's even better, less pretense." How grateful Sarah was then to her accidental savior. She later tried to find this girl, talk to her, say thank you, but it didn't work out. It turned out that Sarah's points were more than enough for the other faculty, so she did become a student after all. As a village girl, she was given a dormitory place and a social scholarship. Sarah couldn't believe her luck for a long time. The girl studied diligently, attended all lectures, submitted her term papers on time, and always did her homework. The professors praised her and held her up as an example to others. This made Sarah a little embarrassed. The girl dedicated all her time and energy to studying. True, she also had to work 2 or 3 hours in the evening as a salesperson in the bakery closest to the dormitory. The scholarship wasn't enough to live on. Her parents, despite all their desire, couldn't help their daughter. So Sarah managed as best she could. Naturally, she had no time at all for clubs, discos, or student parties. Sometimes this made her a little sad, but each time Sarah reminded herself of the goal she was working towards, and everything immediately fell into place. Katie's friends from her group often enthusiastically told her about their weekends, shared details of romantic adventures, and vividly described their admirers. At such moments, the girl also dreamed of having a decent young man by her side, loving, caring, cheerful, handsome, of course. Someone she could fall head over heels in love with. But the guys who came into Sarah's view didn't fit the role of a prince. No, many of them were both handsome and cheerful. But these young men, they seemed too carefree, frivolous, and selfish to Sarah. No, she couldn't tie her fate to any of them. Her friends jokingly called Sarah a bore, and when she refused to go to another party with them, they threatened that she would meet old age alone, surrounded by 10 cats. And then, in her 4th year, the girl finally saw a guy who didn't leave her indifferent. And how had she not noticed him before? Strange. The young man expertly pulled into the parking lot on a black motorcycle. He was wearing jeans, a black t-shirt, and a helmet adorned his head. What was it about Mark that attracted her then? Was it the way he skillfully handled the iron horse, or his special, graceful posture? At that moment, he resembled a prince riding out for a stroll on a noble steed. Anyway, Sarah, who was hurrying to the library, stopped and watched from afar as the motorcyclist dismounted and took off his helmet. For some reason, the girl really wanted to see his eyes. She shouldn't have done that. Because when Mark, as if sensing her gaze, looked toward Sarah, the girl knew she was lost. Piercing turquoise eyes on a tanned face, a snow-white smile, thick hair of some incredibly pleasant wheat shade. Sarah could have admired this guy endlessly if she didn't have to observe the rules of decorum. The girl suddenly felt awkward, standing there, staring at a stranger. What would he think of her? Sarah sharply turned around and hurried towards the building where the library was located. The guy caught up with her. He caught up almost at the entrance itself. He gently held Sarah by the arm. She turned around and flushed, meeting his slightly mocking gaze. The stranger smiled at her warmly, openly, sincerely. Sarah had never felt such feelings before. It was hard to describe in words. Goosebumps ran in crowds down her back and neck. Warmth spread through her body. Her heart pounded like mad. That day, the romance between Sarah and Mark began. At first, it was beautiful, like a fairy tale, but it ended more like a bad horror movie. Mark confessed that he had felt the girl's gaze and understood from her eyes that she was the one he could be happy with. Later, analyzing the situation, Sarah realized that the guy was simply oversaturated with beautiful girls from wealthy families at that moment. They were all spoiled, selfish princesses whom it was impossible to surprise or please with anything. And here was a simple, unsophisticated girl from a village, very pretty besides. Sarah looked at Mark with loving eyes, hung on his every word, and admired everything he did or said. She was happy with such trifles as a simple bouquet of roses. She was amazed by the luxury of the restaurants they visited. Mark found it interesting to observe the behavior and emotions of an unspoiled girl. He was a person who opened a completely new world to the poor student. This made her head spin, instilled belief in her own power and uniqueness, and tickled his ego. And of course, Mark also developed some feelings for the girl for whom he was everything. Otherwise, it would be impossible. But the guy never intended to make Sarah the center of his own universe. True, Sarah only realized all this later, when the problems began. At first, it seemed to her that Mark was performing one feat after another for her. The guy spent money on his girlfriend without stinting. Sarah felt awkward about this. She even tried to refuse at first. If anyone knew, Sarah knew perfectly well that money didn't come easily. Mark worked as a courier and earned money, but that didn't mean he had to spend everything on her. The guy just smiled at all her objections and gave Sarah another luxurious gift. Their relationship was sometimes like a romantic comedy, sometimes like a beautiful melodrama. Mark was so sweet, so attentive, he courted her incredibly beautifully and always knew how to cheer the girl up. Sarah still devoted a lot of time to studying, but now lectures and seminars didn't make up her whole life. Amazingly, there was enough time for everything. For dates with Mark, and for poring over notebooks. It was a wonderful, unforgettable time. Mark and Sarah had been seeing each other for about a year by the time the girl realized with horror that she was pregnant. At first, Sarah couldn't believe it had happened. After all, they had been so careful. But one test after another consistently showed two bright lines. So she had to accept the fact. The girl was in despair. Her diploma, state exams, the finish line were just around the corner. She had worked towards this for so long. Okay, maybe the pregnancy itself wouldn't prevent her from preparing for the final tests. She would write her diploma, pass the exams and credits. But by the end of her 5th year, she would have a huge belly. Who would hire her like that? She would have to stay home and take care of the child. And what was the point of those 5 years of study then? Would Mark be happy about this news? Would he take responsibility for Sarah and the child? Their relationship was supposedly elevated, trusting. But a beautiful romance was one thing, and a burden in the form of a pregnant Sarah was another. The girl cried for about an hour from despair, from resentment, from fear for the future. And then she calmed down and decided to tell everything to the person on whom her fate depended. Mark received the news of Sarah's pregnancy unexpectedly joyfully. For him, it was still a game. Wow, we're going to be parents! The guy's eyes lit up. A smile appeared on his face. We'll have our own little one. Cool. He was happy about the child like a new toy. Only Sarah didn't notice it then. She was happy that the man she loved didn't see the pregnancy as a problem. So, what are we going to do now? The girl asked hopefully, looking at Mark. We'll get married, of course, he smiled, putting his arm around Sarah's shoulders. We'll get married, finish studying, then I'll go to work, and you'll be on maternity leave. And where will we live? Sarah was very worried about this question. She would probably be asked to leave the dormitory soon. Would she have to move into Mark's apartment? Living with her husband's relatives would probably be difficult. They would have to get used to each other. Adjust. We'll live in my apartment, Mark shrugged. My father gave it to me a long time ago. It's big, spacious. You'll like it. I would have moved there a long time ago. But my mother, she said I could only do that when I got married. That was the condition she set. And now I'm getting married. You have an apartment? Sarah still couldn't believe what she had just heard. Who are your parents? She knew little about Mark's family. He preferred to change the subject whenever Sarah brought it up. Well, what's there to tell about them? Mark frowned annoyedly. Parents are parents. My mother is a housewife. She spent her whole life taking care of me and my brothers, taking us to clubs and things. She has 3 of us. Remember I told you? Sarah nodded. Mark had indeed mentioned that he had 2 older brothers. Well, the guy continued, my mother, then, takes care of the house. My father runs his own business. He has a real estate agency. Didn't I tell you? No, Sarah shook her head. Mark had never said that the company he worked for as a courier was owned by his own father. Well, then I'm telling you now. So don't worry, we'll definitely have a place to live. By the way, I need to introduce you to my parents. Now my mother will be happy. She thinks I have my head in the clouds. She always holds my older brothers up as examples, saying they're serious, unlike me. Now she'll find out that I'm responsible too. Sarah was very afraid of meeting Mark's parents. The guy was completely confident that his fiancée would be liked by both his father and mother. The girl herself strongly doubted this. Of course, no one would believe that Sarah hadn't guessed about Mark's wealth. Even her friends thought she had deliberately gotten pregnant by a rich kid. What would his relatives say? But the introduction went more than successfully. Despite the fact that Sarah was initially lost in the luxurious interiors of the mansion where Mark lived with his parents. A round table was set in the living room. Everything looked appetizing and attractive. But from nervousness, Sarah couldn't swallow a bite. Mark's parents introduced themselves. Mrs. Smith, her future mother-in-law, smiled openly at the guest. She had the same piercing turquoise eyes as her son. The girl was amazed by how Mark's mother looked. This woman was much older than her own mother, but Sarah didn't notice wrinkles on Mrs. Smith's face. A slender, toned figure, flawless skin, a stylish, elegant dress. The groom's father, Mr. Smith, also didn't look his age at all. Fit, energetic. In conversation, Mark's parents, despite all their wealth, turned out to be pleasant and simple people. Learning Sarah's story, Mrs. Smith was delighted. What a smart girl you are, she praised the girl. You've already achieved a lot through your own hard work. Amazing determination. I need people like you. Mr. Smith joined the conversation. After your maternity leave, I'll take you on. So don't worry about work. Sarah couldn't believe her luck then. Everything happening seemed like a beautiful fairy tale. Mark's parents not only showed no displeasure with their poor pregnant daughter-in-law, but on the contrary, were genuinely happy for her. Our rascal needs exactly this kind of girl by his side. Mrs. Smith shook her head, smiling at Sarah. Responsible, serious, hard-working. What a happiness that you met. Sarah didn't understand then why the parents called Mark a rascal. He seemed to be a perfectly serious and conscientious young man. Well, of course, he sometimes rode his motorcycle riskily. That was true. And he spent a lot of time with his friends. But Mark was still very young and carefree. It was natural that he wanted to have fun. When else to do it but in youth? Mark's parents threw a lavish wedding for the young couple. Sarah was embarrassed that they covered all the expenses. Her parents were also very awkward. But Mrs. Smith behaved so simply, so naturally, that the tension gradually disappeared. Mrs. Smith spoke very kindly and respectfully to Sarah's mother and father, and even thanked them for raising such a wonderful daughter. She smiled warmly at her daughter-in-law and showered her with compliments. Sarah truly looked like a real princess in the dress that her mother-in-law helped her choose and paid for. Dressed like that, the bride behaved accordingly. Mark was proud that his young wife was so beautiful. For the first half of the wedding, he didn't let go of her hand. But then, when the official part was over, the guy, as always, went off to his friends. Sarah was happy for her new husband then. She liked that he was so sociable and cheerful. Married life was also like a fairy tale at first. Sarah now lived in a huge, stylishly furnished apartment. Before, the girl had only seen such interiors in fashion magazines. It took her a long time to get used to being the rightful mistress of all this splendor. Sarah now had her own card, onto which a tidy sum magically appeared twice a month. Mark transferred money to his wife for household expenses. Accustomed to saving on everything, Sarah at first didn't even manage to spend her salary. It was so wonderful, so unusual, to go into a store and throw everything she liked into the cart, instead of looking for discounted products. The girl's relationship with Mark's parents was excellent. She already considered them family. Mrs. Smith often invited her daughter-in-law over. They talked for a long time. Sarah talked about her life, and her mother-in-law about hers. It turned out that Mrs. Smith was also born and raised in a village, and then her family moved to the big city, where the still very young girl met Arthur, her future husband, and the father of their 3 sons. He was just a simple accountant at the factory back then, the woman recalled the past. It was later that Arthur started his business. I helped him, supported him as much as I could. So, it's our shared creation. And Mrs. Smith often said that she had always dreamed of a daughter. Oh, how I wanted a daughter! But we only had boys. That's why the youngest, your little Mark, was born only because I was hoping for a girl. Last attempt. And here was another boy, and strangely enough, the most loved of all 3. Although at first, of course, I was very disappointed. I was sure I was carrying a daughter this time. Mrs. Smith's 2 older sons gave her a total of 4 grandsons, so even there, the woman didn't get to cuddle a beautiful granddaughter. I dream of buying my granddaughter dolls, braiding her hair, choosing beautiful dresses with her, doing everything I wanted to do with a daughter. And here are boys again. Toy trains, construction sets, cars. No, I adore them, of course, but I so want something sweet, girlish, pink. Now all my hope is in you. Before this confession from her mother-in-law, Sarah didn't care what sex her baby was. But after that, the girl suddenly realized that she also really dreamed of a little girl with turquoise eyes like Mark's and long, beautiful hair. It really would be wonderful to braid hair, tie ribbons, dress the little one in pink dresses. Mark, on the other hand, dreamed of a son. So he said. Although Sarah increasingly began to feel that this child didn't matter to him at all. Mark spent a lot of time at work, and in the evenings and on weekends, he ran off to his friends. This was so unlike the beginning of their relationship. Sarah hoped that when the baby was born, her young husband would settle down. But she was mistaken. Everything got even worse. Katie was born on time. When Sarah was given the tiny red creature to hold against her chest, the girl understood. From this moment on, her life was divided into before and after. Now she was a mother. Mark and his parents arranged a lavish discharge from the hospital for Sarah. Everything was there. An animator in a bear costume, pink and white balloons, flowers, happy touched relatives, and, of course, a cameraman who captured every moment of the celebration. Mrs. Smith tenderly took the pink bundle into her arms. Finally, her long-held dream had come true. Now she had a granddaughter, long awaited and loved. Mark, of course, also seemed happy and even willingly posed for the photographer with his daughter in his arms. But Sarah immediately noticed that he was bored with it all. There was no genuine joy in the young father's eyes. Sarah didn't even notice a flicker of the delight and admiration that she herself, or even her mother-in-law, Mark's mother, felt. Family weekdays flowed on. Sarah completely immersed herself in caring for her daughter. Mrs. Smith often visited the young mother and her newborn girl, teaching her daughter-in-law how to care for an infant. And Sarah was a mother for the first time and didn't really know anything. Where would she? True, the science didn't turn out to be that complicated. Very soon, Sarah felt quite confident. But Mrs. Smith continued to come, and the girl didn't object. She saw how happy her mother-in-law was with her long-awaited granddaughter. It was wonderful that someone else besides the parents loved the child. especially since Mark wasn't very interested in Katie. His daughter seemed to irritate him. He frowned when the girl suddenly started crying, especially after bedtime, complaining about sleepless nights. No, Mark didn't get up when the baby cried. Sarah always rushed to the little one. It was just that these nighttime disturbances interfered with the head of the family's full sleep. Mark spent more and more time away from home. The young husband might even not come home to sleep. To all his wife's questions, Mark replied that he wasn't her slave after all, and had the right to a break from the family. Gradually, the rose-colored glasses fell from Sarah's eyes. Mark showed himself for who he was. That's why Mrs. Smith called her youngest son a rascal and claimed he had his head in the clouds. Mark turned out to be completely unprepared for family life. The worries about a small child weighed on him. No, at family celebrations, he gladly carried his charming, dressed-up daughter in his arms. Sarah saw that her husband was simply admiring himself and was proud of his new role as a father. But on ordinary days, Mark avoided any contact with the little one. He now preferred not to talk to Sarah. It was hurtful and confusing. For the first time, Sarah accidentally overheard her husband's conversation. One morning, Mark thought his wife was in a deep sleep after rocking Katie for 3 hours. The little one hadn't been feeling well. The girl had been fussy the day before and would only doze in her mother's arms. But Sarah, from exhaustion, couldn't close her eyes and, of course, heard everything. Although Mark tried to speak quietly, he was cooing. You couldn't call it anything else, with some girl who was apparently very young, calling her Bunny and my love, laughing at her remarks, promising that they would have fun soon. Sarah lay in bed, barely restraining herself from bursting into the kitchen and causing a scene. But it wouldn't lead to anything. Mark had long since become practically a stranger to her. They lived together. Yes. Mark, importantly, fully provided for her and Katie. But what could she give her daughter if she left him now? So she had to pretend that nothing had happened. Since then, Sarah often noticed signs of Mark's infidelity. Girls called him when he was home. The man barely hid it. No, of course, in his wife's presence, he spoke more restrainedly than when Sarah, in his opinion, heard nothing. Mark might come home in the morning, explaining it as an important business dinner. At the same time, a bracelet from a nightclub often adorned his wrist, and Mark's clothes reeked of women's perfume. And sometimes the man would go on another business trip for 5 to 7 days, from which he invariably returned refreshed, rested, and sometimes even tanned, clearly under the southern sun. Sarah endured all this, feeling humiliated, crushed, lost, and broken during this period. After all, she still loved Mark, and until recently believed that he had feelings for her too. Well, yes, he had cooled down a bit, it happens, especially after a baby appears in the family. For some men, it's like a test of strength. But Mark? It turned out he was having an affair. Probably affairs. He addressed his young and, no doubt, beautiful interlocutors differently. Sometimes Chloe, sometimes Sophia, sometimes even Olivia. Sarah, having put tiny Katie to sleep, often cried, curled up in a ball in the armchair near her daughter's crib. The woman understood that she was in a desperate situation. Living with a husband who cheated right and left was unbearable. At the same time, Mark had long since treated her, his legal wife, as if she were invisible. And when was the last time they had a heart-to-heart talk? Sarah couldn't remember the moment. She had to leave him, otherwise the woman would soon completely lose herself. But what next? Where could she go with a small daughter in her arms? To a rented apartment again, of course. But she would have to go back to work. Katie was still so tiny. She would probably get sick a lot in daycare, like all small children. Who needed an employee like a young mother constantly running off on sick leave? It was unlikely Sarah would find a job during this difficult period. Going back to the village was also a bad idea. Sarah herself had once made maximum efforts to get out of there, and now to live again in a tiny house without normal facilities, and to doom her daughter to such an existence? No, She had to come up with something else. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Smith, continued to visit her daughter-in-law and granddaughter frequently. Each time she brought Katie lavish gifts, sometimes a dress from a famous designer, sometimes tiny gold earrings, sometimes an expensive doll, sometimes an interesting game. It was clear that the elderly woman doted on the girl. Sarah, as the mother of this long-awaited princess, also received gifts and attention. The sensitive Mrs. Smith had long noticed that her daughter-in-law looked sad and thoughtful. She asked her directly many times, but Sarah always avoided answering. She said she hadn't slept well with Katie, that she had a headache. No, Mrs. Smith was a wonderful person. Sarah didn't doubt that at the time. But how could she tell her about the humiliation Sarah had to endure day after day? But one day the woman realized that she had to act. It happened on a rainy autumn evening. Mark came home late, telling his wife he'd had a business dinner at a restaurant. Sarah pretended to believe him, as always. But then she accidentally saw a photograph. Mark was scrolling through his phone feed, looking at something, and smiling happily. The woman only glanced at the screen and was stunned. There was a photo. In it, Mark was posing, embracing a beautiful blonde. She was smiling broadly and pressing gently against the man. It was a selfie. And then, as they say, Sarah's visor dropped. "What is this?" Sarah, without meaning to, immediately burst out shouting. Mark looked at her with completely calm eyes. This photograph, this indifference, this calmness of her husband, who seemed to see nothing unusual in the situation at all, finally drove Sarah over the edge. Long suppressed emotions broke through along with sobs and insults. She called her husband the worst names, shouted hurtful phrases directly into his face. She wanted to hurt him as much as possible. Sarah expected Mark to start making excuses, maybe even apologize. But he looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust, and remained silent. Sarah suddenly, completely losing control, slapped Mark hard. She put all her strength into the blow, so it was quite impactful. As if in slow motion, Sarah watched as Mark's head snapped back. He even had to grab the table to keep from falling. Sarah had achieved what she wanted. She had shaken her husband out of his state of cold indifference. Mark looked at her with such malice that the woman went cold with terror. The man strode towards her and grabbed her hair tightly. Sarah fully felt her husband's strong grip. If he wanted to, Mark could easily crush her with both hands. It was clear that the man was barely restraining himself. Sarah, her eyes wide with fear for her own life, looked at her husband and blamed herself for the unexpected outburst. "Listen to me carefully," Mark hissed. "I'm telling you this once and only once. I won't repeat it. If this happens even one more time, you'll fly out of this apartment like a cork from a bottle. You'll remain the same pauper you were before. You won't see any alimony because my salary is mostly unofficial. You'll get pennies. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded silently, already starting to tremble violently. At that moment, the woman wanted only one thing: for all this to end quickly. But Mark didn't let go of her hair. On the contrary, he continued to wrap it around his fist. "Do you think I don't understand that you deliberately got pregnant by a rich guy? Do you think you're the only one so clever? I didn't marry you because you're so cunning and shrewd. I'll explain why now. Firstly, you used to be quite good-looking. Secondly, a marriage with someone like you should be easy and unburdensome. People like you should be happy with the conditions you found yourselves in. Raise children, serve your husband, and don't open your mouth unnecessarily. Everyone has their own benefit. Yours is comfort, wealth, a calm, secure life. Mine is freedom. Do I really need to explain this? Spoon-feed it to you? Is it really not clear to you yourself?" Mark forcefully pushed his wife away. Sarah backed towards the door. The man's eyes still blazed with fury. Fortunately, he did restrain himself and didn't hit his wife, but he was clearly very close to it. Sarah understood at that moment. Such a scene would happen again and again. Mark would find something to pick on, and he might hit her. He could easily hit her, and he would do it sooner or later. After the incident, life went on as usual. Mark also disappeared somewhere day and night. Now he didn't hide, he talked to his girls right in front of his wife. Sarah was no longer just hurt, she was scared. She understood that she couldn't live like this for long. Such an existence was slowly destroying her. But there was no way out. Mark was right. She had nowhere to go, nothing to live on. And then, in despair, Sarah made the biggest mistake. She turned to Mrs. Smith for help. The woman believed that her mother-in-law treated her well. She gave gifts, always spoke exclusively kindly, constantly complimented her, saying her daughter-in-law cooked wonderfully and raised her daughter correctly. Therefore, Sarah never expected to hear such words from Mrs. Smith. "Well, that's not surprising," she shrugged. "Little Mark, he's been a rascal since he was young. I didn't expect— No, I used to think. I hoped he would settle down, grow up. But now I see clearly. He's an eternal child." "But what about me?" Sarah looked at her mother-in-law hopefully. Perhaps she would suggest a way out? "Well, what now? Live as you are. Mark will provide for you and your daughter from head to toe. I guarantee that. Well, what can you do? That's the price for a comfortable life." "You won't even talk to him?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "I don't see the point." Mrs. Smith shook her head. "You can't change Mark." I can't live with him. I'll get a divorce." "Foolish." Her mother-in-law seemed to start worrying. "And how will you manage alone? Alimony will be pennies. You have nowhere to live." "I'll go to my parents in the village. Better that than endure all this. Katie will grow up, then I'll think about how to move back to the big city." "You'll take Katie?" Now Mrs. Smith was seriously worried. "So I won't see her?" "No, I won't deprive you of her," Sarah assured. "You can visit sometimes or I can come to you, but I can't live with Mark anymore. He's cruel, selfish, it's destroying me." "So I'll see my granddaughter when you graciously allow it?" her mother-in-law clarified. It seemed she had ignored the words about her son. She was only concerned about Katie, her long-awaited, beloved granddaughter, the object of her pride and adoration. "But it seems that's the case. I am her mother, so it's up to me to decide who my child sees and when." "You're mistaken, dear. It's a good thing you confided your plans to me. The child will be left with Mark in case of divorce. I'll take care of that." "No!" Now it was Sarah's turn to be scared. Children are usually awarded to the mother in our country. That's how it always is. "Yes, but that's if the mother is able to support the child. And are you planning to deprive your daughter of normal living conditions? Take her to a remote village, to a house without amenities. And you don't have a job. But Mark has a large, well-equipped apartment, and they'll put whatever salary is needed on his documents, so evaluate your chances yourself." "But Mark doesn't need her!" Sarah exclaimed in despair. She hadn't expected such a turn of events at all. Only recently, the woman had considered her mother-in-law a future ally, a helper. Honestly, Sarah had counted on Mrs. Smith helping her with Katie after the divorce, both morally and physically. But it turned out that her mother-in-law had simply decided to take her daughter away from her. "But I need her," Mrs. Smith said slowly. "I've dreamed of a daughter all my life, then of a granddaughter. So many plans, so many hopes. And now I have Katie. And now you want to take her away? No way." Sarah still found the strength to leave her husband then. Katie had just turned 3. It wasn't easy. Sarah was greatly supported by her parents and aunt. With their combined efforts, they raised money so that their daughter and niece could rent an apartment in the big city, a well-equipped, clean, spacious one, such that it wouldn't raise questions from the guardianship authorities, to whom Mrs. Smith had of course turned. Her relatives paid the apartment rent for a whole 6 months. During this time, Sarah enrolled her daughter in daycare and found a job. Now she had good living conditions and enough salary to support the child. In other words, Mrs. Smith couldn't take the girl. But the fight for Katie continues to this day. Sarah hoped that one of Mrs. Smith's sons would have a daughter, and her mother-in-law would shift her attention to her. But Mark, who soon after the divorce married a young woman resembling a fashion model, became the father of 2 sons. The wife of one of his brothers also gave birth to a boy. So Katie remained Mrs. Smith's only granddaughter, which is why she didn't give up. Her former mother-in-law kept writing complaints about Sarah to the guardianship authorities. Sometimes she didn't look after the child. Sometimes she was too busy with her personal life. Sometimes she treated the girl cruelly. Both Sarah and her mother had gotten used to police officers or representatives of the guardianship authorities frequently visiting them for checks. Naturally, they found no violations, but Sarah lived in constant fear. Who knows? Mrs. Smith was a rich and influential woman. Sooner or later, she would come up with something, eventually orchestrate some situation. Sarah couldn't imagine life without Katie anymore. The girl was the center of her universe. Everything Sarah did was for her daughter. Mark wasn't interested in Katie's affairs and didn't participate in her life at all, transferring tiny alimony payments from the official part of his earnings, and that was it. This approach suited Sarah perfectly. If he didn't interfere with communication, that was good. Less stress. It was a pity Mrs. Smith wasn't so indifferent. Now Sarah was hurrying home. Katie was probably already waiting for her mother from work. Sarah had indeed stayed late. She went into the shopping center for a minute and ended up spending almost an hour there. So much new, so much interesting, and good discounts everywhere. Now Sarah was rushing home, skillfully navigating through the crowd of passers-by, of whom there were many near the shopping center at this hour. Suddenly, the woman's attention was drawn to an old woman. Frail, stooped, in an old coat, her head wrapped in a gray downy shawl, worn felt boots on her feet. The elderly woman's eyes were an amazing pale blue color, as if slightly faded. The old woman looked around, addressing one person, then another, but people didn't hear or see her. Passers-by hurried on their way without slowing down, but Sarah couldn't pass by. Catching up with the old woman, she stopped. The grandmother seemed to understand that she finally had a listener. She looked directly into Sarah's eyes and whispered in a quiet voice, "Daughter, please help me. I'm in a desperate situation." Sarah saw that this was indeed true. Judging by the old woman's expression, she was in a state close to panic. "What happened?" Sarah asked in the softest possible tone. "I came here for meat," the elderly stranger began to explain. "You know, there's a good one in the basement here. Well, while I was going back and forth, I put my hand in my pocket, and my wallet wasn't there. And only then did it hit me. I forgot it at home, didn't take it, left it on the nightstand. It's all Mittens, the cat. While I was chasing that rogue from the street, everything just flew out of my head. Luckily, I had money for a one-way ticket in another pocket, so I got here without any problems. But I don't know how to get home now." "So you need money for the bus?" Sarah clarified. "I do," the grandmother said shyly. "It's awkward to ask like this, begging like a pauper. But what can I do? The bus drivers are angry now, they won't take you just like that. And I need an intercity bus too. I live outside the big city, in a cottage village. I tried to go back, asked a driver if he would take me without money, and he chewed me out in front of all the passengers so badly that I'm afraid to ask anyone else now." "And did none of the passengers help?" Sarah asked, genuinely surprised. "No," the old woman sighed sadly. "Well, there weren't many people there, thankfully. Otherwise the driver would have shamed me so badly. So badly." "It's nothing. Of course I'll help you." Sarah readily reached into her wallet. "Daughter, thank you so much. God bless such a good, caring person." The elderly woman was almost crying with gratitude. "Give me your address or phone number. Better write it down. My son will transfer the money to you later." "It's not necessary," Sarah smiled. "It's not difficult for me to help. Kind people helped me in a difficult moment too. So, consider it repaid." "Thank you, my dear." Sarah nodded and walked on. She was in a hurry. Katie was waiting for her at home. Sarah spent a wonderful evening with her daughter. They indulged in ice cream and pizza, watched movies, cuddling on the sofa. At such moments, Sarah felt happy and protected. What warm and cozy evenings they were. The woman waited all week for Friday, precisely to relax and unwind like this in her daughter's company. Sometimes, very rarely, on weekends, Sarah would go out somewhere with friends or colleagues, to the cinema, a bar, a nightclub. If Mrs. Smith somehow found out about this outing, a mandatory visit from the guardianship authorities would immediately follow. And how did her mother-in-law manage to find out about her former daughter-in-law's personal life? Was she spying on her? Her friends thought Sarah should find a man long ago. "You're young, beautiful," her colleague Megan urged her, "and always alone. You can't live like that. Kate will grow up. She'll start her own life. And what about you? Will you be left alone?" Sarah just smiled and shook her head. After Mark's betrayal, all men seemed like deceivers to her. No, she didn't want to date anyone at all, go on dates again, hope again that she had met the ideal person, and then be bitterly disappointed. No way! And Sarah didn't have time for romances, to be honest. Work, child, household chores and problems, all on her fragile shoulders. No thank you. She wasn't up for it at all. Saturday morning in Sarah and Katie's family always started late. Mother and daughter preferred to sleep in after a hard work week and getting up at 6 in the morning. But this time, the sleepy silence of the apartment was broken by a sharp, piercing ring. Sarah struggled to open her eyelids and looked at the clock. It was only 10. I wonder who decided to bother them so early on a Saturday. Neighbors, probably. The woman reluctantly got out of bed, threw on her robe. A sleepy Katie was already coming out of her room. She looked so sweet, so funny in her ridiculous bare pajamas. Well, the morning visitor hadn't let the girl lie in bed peacefully. Meanwhile, the doorbell rang for the second time. "I'm coming!" Sarah shouted, trying to keep her voice from sounding too annoyed. The woman looked through the peephole, and immediately anxiety seized her. A man was standing on the landing, tall, young, unfamiliar. It wasn't one of the neighbors, as Sarah had first thought. "Who is it?" the woman asked. "My name is Daniel." The person behind the door introduced himself. "I have a few questions for you." "Are you from the police, or maybe from guardianship?" Sarah was used to visits from officials, but they usually introduced themselves with their full name and patronymic, adding their rank. But here... "No, I'm not from the police. Do you understand? I'm the son of the old woman you gave money for a ticket yesterday." "Ah, that's what this is about." The elderly woman had indeed sent her son to give her the money back. But how did this man know her address? Sarah hadn't given it to the grandmother yesterday. Strange and very suspicious. "I understand you're afraid to open the door to me." Daniel's voice came from behind the door again. "And rightly so. In our time, you have to be vigilant. Let's do this. I'll go out of the building now and wait for you on the porch, okay? We'll talk there." "All right," Sarah agreed. Indeed, that was the most reasonable option. At the same time, the stranger's morning visit still seemed strange and suspicious. First and foremost, Sarah was worried about how this person had found her. The woman looked out the window. Daniel was indeed standing near the entrance, waiting for her. It was a little scary to leave the apartment. What if this person was still some kind of criminal, and his accomplice was left on the landing? But there was no one near the door. Sarah went downstairs. Daniel met her on the porch. "You see, I have a question for you. A delicate one," the man began. Sarah immediately tensed up. Something told her that the conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "What is it?" "My mother, she's very old now. Age, her head isn't quite right. She's not legally incapacitated, of course. But Mom, she's like a child, you understand?" Sarah nodded. Of course, she knew that many people became childlike with age, and although yesterday's old woman hadn't given that impression, if her son said so, then it must be true. But what did Sarah have to do with it? Yesterday, Mom was in a desperate situation, left without money, far from home. She was probably in despair. That's why she offered you her item in exchange for a bus ticket. What item? Sarah asked, genuinely surprised. The old woman hadn't offered her any item. The only thing she asked for was a phone number to transfer the money. What do you mean? What item? The man looked at Sarah intently. Something hostile appeared in his entire demeanor. She didn't give me anything. I mean, nothing at all. She just asked for money. I gave it to her, and that's it. And that's it? You're lying to me now. There are witnesses who saw and heard everything. In fact, it's thanks to them that I found you. An acquaintance of mine works nearby. He saw the whole scene and then noticed which entrance you went into. And finding you there wasn't difficult. He just asked the neighbors which apartment you lived in and described your appearance based on his friend's words. I don't understand anything. Sarah shook her head. What are you accusing me of? Nothing yet. Mom gave you the jewelry voluntarily. You didn't extort it. There are witnesses to that. But now when you're being stubborn, it doesn't look very good. You took advantage of the fact that the old woman wasn't in her right mind and took possession of a valuable item. What valuable item? Sarah exclaimed. Just explain everything properly. I don't understand anything. And you, it seems, are a brilliant actress, Daniel sneered, curling his lips. To be honest, I hoped this was some kind of misunderstanding. By the way, it's a brooch, our family heirloom. Not only is it worth a considerable sum on its own, but it's also an antique, you understand? It's worth a fortune. And you think I have it? Well, who else? You gave the old woman money for the bus yesterday? Yes? Well, in return, she offered you her brooch. Perhaps you only took it because you didn't understand how valuable and expensive it is. Daniel seemed to be giving Sarah one last chance to get out of the situation with dignity. I didn't see any brooch. This is some kind of misunderstanding. Mom said she gave it to the girl who paid for her fare. That's you, which means you have the brooch. No, I don't. How can I prove it to you? Just give back the jewelry, and that's it. I have a witness, and Mom will confirm it in court if necessary. She'll confirm that you took the jewelry from her. In court? Sarah felt cold, sticky goosebumps crawl up her spine. This man? Was he really going to sue her? This is absurd. But he had a witness. Apparently, he really does. Otherwise, how would he have found her so quickly? And what if Sarah can't prove anything in court? What if she's accused of extortion? After all, no one is immune to judicial errors. There are plenty of such cases. Sarah clutched her head. She absolutely cannot become a defendant right now. Or even a suspect. No way. Mrs. Smith knows her every move. She'll surely find out about this whole story immediately, and of course use it to her advantage. Problems with the law for the mother? That's a significant argument for the guardianship authorities. They could take Katie away. This cannot be allowed. If you've already gotten rid of the brooch, Daniel spoke again in a soft, insinuating voice. Well, who knows? You knew they'd be looking for it, right? So you sold it as quickly as possible. Then at least return the money. It's worth about... And the man named a figure that made Sarah's head spin. She wouldn't be able to save that much in several years, and they probably wouldn't give her a loan. The previous one isn't paid off yet, and her salary wouldn't allow it. Unless maybe somewhere at a high interest rate? How would she live then? On what? The situation seemed hopeless. She couldn't allow a court case because in that case, her mother-in-law would finally get a chance to get custody of her granddaughter. But there was nowhere to get the money either. You're mistaken. Sarah tried to reach Daniel one more time. I didn't take this brooch, and I don't have the money. Excellent. Then we'll settle everything through court. The jewelry was insured. If they prove your guilt, which I personally have no doubt about, we'll at least get compensation. But in that case, you'll have big problems. Wait, Sarah exclaimed. Give me some time to think. This trouble has fallen on me so unexpectedly, I don't even know what to do. Just give back the jewelry or return the money. Sarah shook her head. She wanted to scream right in the negative Daniel's face that she hadn't taken anything, but perhaps it wasn't worth angering him, because her fate depended on him now. I need time. All right, Daniel nodded. But don't think too long. We'll exchange phone numbers now. I'll call you the day after tomorrow. I hope you'll have found the money by then, or finally decide to give back the brooch. Because otherwise we'll talk differently, and most likely, in court. Daniel sharply turned around and walked towards the parking lot. Sarah watched him for a long time. Mom, what happened? Katie looked at her mother, who had returned after the unpleasant conversation, with fear. You're so pale. Who was that man? Just an old acquaintance. It's nothing serious. Sarah smiled faintly. Shall we make pancakes? Remember you promised to teach me? Of course. Katie and Sarah spent about an hour pottering in the kitchen. The girl happily chattered about her friends and teachers. The woman nodded, smiled where appropriate, was surprised where appropriate, praised. But Sarah's thoughts were far away. She was thinking about how to get out of this strange situation. Daniel won't give up, that's obvious. He's convinced that Sarah took the expensive brooch. Nothing will dissuade him. That old woman? Why did she say that about her? Maybe the grandmother is really not in her right mind and doesn't know what she's saying? Or maybe the elderly woman, having lost the brooch, invented a story for her son so he wouldn't scold her. Judging by Daniel's behavior, he knows how to be tough, even cruel. Cold gaze, jerky movements. Anyway, Sarah needs to figure something out now. She absolutely cannot become a suspect right now. It's unknown if she'll be able to prove her innocence. There's only one option left. Find the money. But where? There's no one to help Sarah. Her parents live in poverty themselves. Her salary is decent, of course. But the debt that suddenly fell on her won't be covered even in several years, and she's unlikely to get a loan. There was one way out. Turn to Mark. The main thing is that the man doesn't blab to his mother, and he'll quickly figure out how to turn the situation to his advantage. She's been dreaming of taking Katie for herself for a long time. And Mark? He doesn't need his daughter, that's for sure. He won't fight for her. She'll have to swallow her resentment and pride and call her ex-husband. How hard is that? How unbearably hard. But what else can she do? Mark never participated in his daughter's life, except for the meager alimony that was deposited into Katie's card every month. Maybe he can help just this one time? For him, the sum Daniel is demanding isn't that big. Sarah sent her daughter to watch cartoons and dialed a number she hadn't used in many years. Mark answered immediately. We need to talk. Is something wrong with Katie? Mark asked in a rather indifferent tone. No, but it concerns her too. Something has happened to me. They met that same evening at a cafe. Mark had once invited Sarah here on dates. Wonderful strawberry eclairs used to be sold here many years ago. However, they weren't on the menu now. So, what's happened to you? Mark made it clear he had little time. 5 years had passed since their divorce. Mark hadn't changed much during that time. He still looked like a carefree guy from a youth series, a stylish regular at nightclubs. Perhaps Mrs. Smith was right. Mark was an eternal boy. Sarah briefly told her ex-husband what had happened to her. A smirk appeared in Mark's eyes. Yeah, something like that could only happen to you. He's a typical fraudster. Threaten him with a police report. He's going to file a report against me, Sarah sighed. And I can't get involved there. You know yourself, your mother. She's just waiting for the right moment to take Katie. Mother. Mark sighed sadly. That's true. I'm tired of it too. She's always nagging me to sue for my daughter. Why would I need that? And a child is always better off with their mother. Sarah nodded, and then asked again, But will you help me? Will you lend me money? Without interest? I'll pay it back little by little from each salary. No, Mark replied. I'm not going to sponsor criminals. He'll demand even more later. That's the kind of people they are. You can't feed them. Sarah sighed. She already understood that she wouldn't get help from Mark. And anyway, turning to him was a mistake. When he calls you, tell him that a report against him is already at the station, her ex-husband advised as a parting shot. Then he paid the bill and left the cafe with long, sweeping strides. And Sarah was left alone with her problem again. Yes, she understood that Daniel might be a fraudster. But what if he wasn't? She couldn't take any risks, because Mrs. Smith, she wasn't sleeping. Just recently, her mother-in-law had reported to the guardianship authorities that her daughter-in-law was out at night and not taking care of her child, and all because Sarah had gone to a friend's birthday. Katie had indeed stayed home alone at that time. She brushed her teeth, made her bed, and went to sleep. Sarah returned when her daughter was already asleep. How had Mrs. Smith found out about everything? Very simply, she saw a photo that included Sarah on one of her friend's pages, matched the dates and times, and used the picture as evidence. Sarah was indeed advised then to hire a nanny for such occasions, but she was also sympathized with. Living under the watchful eye of her former mother-in-law was difficult. Mrs. Smith's persistence and desire to take her granddaughter were increasingly frightening Sarah. If she found out about a court case now, she would use all her connections to fulfill her long-held dream. No, Sarah wouldn't give her that chance. What should she do? The woman decided to walk home. The way wasn't too short, but the weather was wonderful. Spring, the sun was shining, birds were singing, the sky was clear and very blue, not a cloud. The snow was melting literally before her eyes. Thawed patches had already appeared on the asphalt. Before, Sarah always felt a surge of spirits at such moments. Nature was waking up. Her favorite time of year, summer, was just around the corner. But today her heart was heavy. An absolutely unbearable problem had suddenly fallen on Sarah. How to solve it? Look for money or try to prove to Daniel that she had nothing to do with it? Both options seemed unworkable. Sarah trudged past the same shopping center where she had met the old woman. Of all the luck, they had to run into each other that evening. If Sarah had gone home later or earlier, none of this would have happened. She would have lived peacefully, enjoying the coming spring, the sun, the upcoming vacation. And suddenly the woman stopped as if struck by lightning. She even blinked a few times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. The same old woman was walking across the parking lot. The coat, the downy shawl, and the eyes of an incredible pale blue shade. Next to the grandmother, carefully supporting her by the elbow so she wouldn't slip on the melting snow, walked a young man. And it wasn't Daniel. Not tall, fair-haired, with a pleasant, open face and eyes exactly like the old woman's. He was smiling and telling the elderly woman something. She listened attentively, occasionally interjecting her own remarks. The couple was walking away. They would probably get into this man's car soon and leave. No, this couldn't be allowed. Fate itself had given Sarah a unique chance to get out of a difficult situation. Now she would talk to the old woman, and perhaps everything would become clear. Sarah hurried after the man and the elderly woman across the parking lot. Maybe they're in league with that man. Sarah is about to have another unpleasant conversation, but it's worth trying, isn't it? "Wait!" Sarah shouted to the old woman and the man when they were almost out of sight around the corner. The elderly woman was the first to turn around. For a moment, she peered at Sarah, squinting her nearsighted eyes, and a smile lit up the old woman's face. Apparently, she recognized the passerby who had given her money for her fare a couple of days ago. The man saw Sarah for the first time, and therefore looked questioningly at the stranger hurrying towards them at full speed. "Hello," Sarah breathed out, catching up with the couple. "Good day," the man greeted her. "Hello, daughter," the grandmother smiled warmly. "I recognized you. It was you who helped me then. Thank you very much." The man, finally understanding what was going on, also smiled. So it was you who didn't pass by my mother then? She told me how desperate she was, and people were rushing by and not paying attention to her. Only you responded. So you are also her son? Sarah clarified. What do you mean also? The grandmother was surprised. Paul is my only son, a late, long-awaited one. Before him, I only had daughters. I have 4 daughters. They are all much older than my son. The older ones are already grandmothers themselves. But what about Daniel? Sarah looked wide-eyed at the mother and son. What Daniel? The old woman frowned. I don't think I know anyone like that. Did something happen to you? Paul finally guessed. And is it somehow connected to that time you met my mother? Right? Sarah nodded silently. She didn't understand anything yet. One thing was clear. Daniel was a fraudster after all, and now it was absolutely certain. But many questions remained, and the main one, how to act now. Daniel is a fraudster. Sarah has come into his sight. Who knows how he'll behave? What if he starts threatening her? Or even does something to her? Or, God forbid, to Katie? How terrifying. Tell us what happened, Paul asked gently. Well, it's not your problem. Why take on extra worries? Just please leave your phone number because it might be needed soon. Tell us. Paul gently stroked Sarah's shoulder. This friendly gesture, it changed a lot. The woman suddenly realized that she wanted to share her story with this person. Very much so. First, I should probably introduce myself, she sighed. My name is Sarah. That evening I was coming home from work. I came out of the shopping center and saw an elderly woman. She was asking people something, but everyone was rushing about their business. And Sarah told them everything. How she gave the old woman money for her fare, about the morning call, and the conversation with Daniel, and she also mentioned her own doubts and anxieties. She had to share details of her personal life with her listeners. How else would they understand why Sarah hadn't gone to the police right away? Paul listened without interrupting. His mother occasionally shook her head, clucked her tongue, and sighed, sometimes interjecting angry, condemning remarks. She was harsh on Daniel and on Mrs. Smith. Sarah's former mother-in-law got her share, and Mark, who didn't help the mother of his child in a difficult moment. What an inhuman person. The old woman shook her head. He understood that Daniel was a fraudster. Well, he could have met with him, talked to him man to man. Yes, dear girl, you're having a hard time in this life, all by yourself. After listening to Sarah, Paul thought about her story in silence for some time. His mother, meanwhile, showered the woman with words of support. It was clear that she sincerely wanted to encourage Sarah, to instill in her confidence that everything would be all right. From this care, tears even welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she quickly blinked them back. This wasn't the time to relax. We'll expose this, Daniel, Paul finally said. And he said it so convincingly that Sarah felt with every cell of her body. She was no longer alone, she had protection. This is strange, unexpected. After all, Paul and his mother are complete strangers. Still, Sarah had not the slightest doubt. Paul knows what to do in this situation. I have a good friend who works in the investigative committee. I started there myself, but then I went into business. I needed money urgently. My father was very ill. I'll call my friend right now, and I'll keep you updated on what happens. You'll have to come in and give a statement. When exactly? I don't know yet, but definitely in the near future. Sarah nodded. Yes. Now it wasn't scary to turn to representatives of the law. Thank you, the woman said. Thank you for your concern. Why wouldn't I help a good person? The man smiled. From this smile, Sarah felt warm inside. You didn't pass by my mother when she needed help either, and you got into this terrible situation only because of us. On the way home, Sarah replayed the details of that conversation again and again. Well, I'll be. Is it really true? Sarah was seriously afraid that meeting Paul was just a hallucination. What if her brain, desperately searching for a way out of a difficult situation, simply invented this scene? No, of course, that can't be. And yet, there were doubts. Paul called a couple of hours later. Sarah hadn't expected such promptness. At first, she flinched at the sharp trill of her mobile phone. Fear squeezed her heart with a cold, sticky hand. What if it's Daniel again? He'll start threatening, accusing, frightening again. But Paul's cheerful voice came through the receiver. Can you be on P Street in 40 minutes? They're waiting for you in office 307. They're already aware. Of course. Well, then everything spun with dizzying speed. Paul was already waiting for Sarah on the steps of a tall building with massive columns. Seeing him, the woman felt relieved. He was there, which meant everything would be all right. Paul escorted Sarah to the investigator's office. He asked her questions about Daniel. Sarah described the appearance and behavior of the man who had introduced himself as the son of the supposedly deceived old woman. If he calls, stall for time, the investigator said finally. We've started investigating this guy. We'll start gathering material, but we need at least a couple of days. Tell him you're arranging loans or something like that. Your phone is being tapped, by the way. You know, you signed the consent yourself, so we'll hear everything he tells you. Sarah nodded silently. Paul offered to drive the woman home. She gladly agreed. Not because she didn't want to trudge to the bus stop. No, it was just, it's so great to spend some more time with this person. Sarah was surprised at herself. She had only known Paul for a short time, but next to him, she felt such calmness, such peace, that she didn't want to part with this man at all. What is this? The beginning of some feelings? Or is it just her gratitude showing towards someone who didn't remain indifferent to her trouble? What does it matter? The main thing is they'll see each other again. The case isn't closed yet, and Paul promised he'd see it through. So that's how it will be. That evening, Daniel called Sarah again. Following the investigator's advice, the woman asked for a delay. You still won't believe that I didn't take any brooch? Sarah asked this question only so that Daniel would confirm his claims aloud. There was no brooch. But the man stubbornly insisted that Sarah had tricked the elderly person and swindled the jewelry from the old woman. Aren't you tired of pretending? Daniel sneered. You have the brooch. You took it from my mother, taking advantage of her helpless state, and now you're denying it. I'm calling the police. No, Sarah feigned fear. I can't afford to be under suspicion right now. The situation is such that it's easier to pay the money. I've already started arranging a loan, but the procedure isn't quick. You'll have to wait. How long? About 2 days? All right, I'll call again. And Daniel hung up. Sarah exhaled with relief. She had succeeded. She had managed to buy a couple of days, as the investigator had asked. The rest of the evening passed as usual. Sarah helped her daughter with another project. They made dinner together and played Monopoly for a bit. Sarah tried not to think about Paul, but she couldn't help herself, recalling his pale blue eyes and wide smile again and again. The woman checked herself. Most likely Paul isn't single. Maybe he even has a wife and children. She's already dreaming things up. If so, his significant other is lucky. Being with such a person is great happiness. The next day also flew by, unremarkable in any way. But then, during her lunch break, Sarah's mobile phone chirped merrily. A name appeared on the screen. Paul. The woman's heart sweetly froze. At the same time, an unpleasant chill appeared in her stomach. Who knows what news Paul was calling her with? The man suggested meeting at a cafe near the building where Sarah worked. The woman, just in case, warned her boss about a possible delay from her lunch break and hurried to the cafe. Paul was already waiting for her at a table. He looked calm and happy. From his expression, Sarah immediately knew everything was all right. The woman involuntarily admired Paul, high cheekbones, confidence, a calm gaze. Good afternoon. Paul rose from his seat and pulled out a chair for Sarah. Pure gallantry. I have some news. Good news. More than good. I'll start with the main thing. Daniel has been apprehended. It turns out he has many victims under investigation simultaneously. About 5 just now, and those are just the ones we've been able to identify. 5? Sarah, strangely enough, was even a little pleased by this information. It turns out she wasn't the only naive fool who fell for Daniel's hook. 5, Paul confirmed. And then he told details about the man who had demanded the expensive antique brooch from Sarah. It turned out he had grown up in an orphanage. Daniel didn't want to work in the profession he learned there. A plasterer painter has to work hard. Daniel didn't like that. He liked a beautiful life and easy money. At first, the guy was a pickpocket, got caught a couple of times, but in both cases he was lucky. The victims were touched by the orphan's pitiful story and withdrew their statements. Daniel realized that operating in that role was risky, so he started acting more subtly. The young man figured out that there were many trusting and simply stupid people in the world, and he could make money from them without much effort. Daniel started tricking people over the phone. Many people, especially without going into details, transferred quite decent sums of money to the guy's cards. Daniel was sometimes surprised by the size of the transfers himself, but over time, it became more difficult to work. It was too risky, hard not to leave a trace. Daniel was invited to work for companies that professionally engaged in such phone calls, where the chance of getting caught was practically minimal. But Daniel dreamed of a solo career. The guy had no shortage of imagination or attentiveness. He enjoyed coming up with new schemes, composing incredible stories. This was apparently how Daniel's creative side manifested itself. With Sarah, it was quite interesting. He accidentally saw her in court one day. It was another time she had ended up there because of her former mother-in-law. The woman had easily proven then that she was perfectly capable of raising her daughter independently. But Daniel immediately realized Sarah clearly wouldn't want to become the heroine of a detective story, to come to the attention of the police. And that meant she was an excellent potential victim. She wouldn't just not report Daniel, you could even threaten her with the police. Here, Daniel was spot on. He knew how to draw conclusions. So Sarah became a potential victim. Now Daniel occasionally followed her, waiting for a convenient moment. But the opportunity never presented itself. Sarah's life was measured and monotonous, in Daniel's opinion, even boring. The guy wasn't worried. He always had work. People fell into his nets just like that, and it was always some completely unique story. Daniel was particularly proud of some of his exploits. Once, he managed to get an old woman from the neighboring house to sign over her apartment to him. Daniel convinced the elderly woman that he was the child of her deceased son. This turned out to be easy. The elderly lady herself wanted very much to believe in the grandson who had suddenly appeared. The old woman was lonely, unsociable. Her only relative was a brother who expected to get the living space after his sister's death. But it didn't work out. The apartment became Daniel's property. Everything came out only after that grandmother had passed away. True, such large fish didn't fall into his net anymore, but Daniel wasn't worried about it. Greed wasn't good, even dangerous. And then, one day, Daniel accidentally noticed Sarah helping an unfamiliar old woman, and a plan instantly formed in his head. The story somehow came together on its own. He only didn't account for one thing, Paul smiled. You accidentally ran into that very old woman near the shopping center. The probability was minimal. My mother lives far from here, and Daniel, of course, found that out before acting. So that's how circumstances aligned. It's hard to believe, Sarah said slowly. And what will happen to him now? He'll go where he belongs. He'll sit and think about his behavior. The investigator pulled the threads, and so many other victims were found. Many of them have already given statements. Some are just getting ready to. In short, romance and creativity are waiting for bunk beds. Sarah still couldn't believe that the problem that had poisoned her life for these few days no longer existed. So, nothing connected her and Paul anymore? He would leave this cafe now, and that would be it? The conversation seemed to have reached a logical conclusion. All that remained for Sarah was to thank Paul for his help again. The man took a deep breath and said, "And I don't want you to think that I'm taking advantage of the savior role all that. But if I invite you to the movies tonight, what would you say?" Sarah felt a pleasant warmth spread in her chest. She had to try her best to keep herself from screaming with joy right now. Apparently, her emotions were clearly visible on her face because Paul understood everything and smiled.